Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the July 16th Board of Education business meeting. We have a quorum of members present. I will call the meeting to order. We'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance and a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everybody. Before we move to the approval of the agenda, I would first like to welcome and recognize Jessen Gronendijk? Close? Okay.
Close.
I'll get it by the time, at least by December, I hope. I just want to welcome you to, I know you've been to a number of our meetings, but for those who might be watching and seeing for the first time a new student member of the board, I want to welcome you. And if I know there are 7 of us plus the superintendent who are more than happy to try to do whatever we can do to help make you successful. And please feel free to reach out to any of us as the year goes forward.
Thank you.
Do you have anything you'd like to offer as we get started?
I'm just like to say I'm very excited to spend a year with such great, smart people. I mean, you guys obviously have only a tiny bit more experience than I do, but I'm looking forward to learning from you and going forward.
Hopefully by the time you're finished with your year term, you'll still think we're great, smart people. We'll find out. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Thank you, Mrs. Brightman. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Are there any comments, amendments, discussion? Seeing none, the question's on the approval of the agenda. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs. Next is the approval of the minutes.
Mr. President, I move for the adoption of minutes from the closed session meeting held on June 25th, 2013, and a business meeting on the same date. Both sets of minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. Brightman. Is there any discussion or amendments on the minutes? Seeing none, the question is on Mr. Bailey's motion to approve the minutes. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? The motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs. Next on the agenda is public comment. Nobody has signed up to speak today. Is there anybody who's come to the meeting that would like the opportunity to speak? All right, we'll move on then. Old business, consideration, the first reading and adoption of revised policy ADF, wellness, physical and nutritional health.
Good afternoon, Dr. Harding, board members, Dr. Wilcox. We are bringing the second reading of the Wellness Policy and Nutritional Health on June 4th, 2013. The first reading of the proposed changes to policy ADF were presented to the Board of Education at its public business meeting, and the board approved the first reading. Since the first reading, the proposed changes to this policy were placed on the Board of Education's webpage, and members of the public were invited to provide comments. No comments were provided. At this time, I'm requesting the approval of the second reading of the proposed changes to policy ADF.
Thank you, Dr. Marco. Is there a motion to approve the second reading of policy ADF, wellness, physical and nutritional health?
Mr. President, I move for the approval on second read of policy ADF, wellness, physical and nutritional health.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Any discussion, questions, or comments? Mrs. Williams? Sure.
I do have a few questions, and I apologize for not asking these at the time we were doing our first reading. policy. My first question is, what exactly is the policy? As I read this, it appears that we have a rationale for a policy, and it says that we're going to have regulation, ADF-R, but as I looked at the requirements of the Child Nutrition and WIC, the WIC Reauthorization Act of 2004, I read that there are to be 5 inclusions in a policy, and it lists those very specific 5 things, and I'm not seeing them in the policy. So my question is then, is this in fact a policy?
First of all, I would point out that the Wellness Committee conducted several meetings, and they examined the existing policy and administrative regulations. So what we're presenting to you is the work of that work group, and also the recommendation of the Policy Committee to that this be adopted.
Mr. Trotter, could you just explain what the Wellness Committee is and who are members of the Wellness Committee, and for people watching who may not know?
Yes, I'll be glad to. The Wellness Committee is composed of several school principals. The Washington County Health Department has a representative as part of that work group, and it also is a representative of Veritas. And they met several times, and they felt that the best approach would be to have a short, concise policy, but to place all of the details in administrative regulation. So what you have before you is the existing policy, and as you can see, it's been shortened substantially. You observed the reference to Attachment A. My recommendation would be that that be stricken. I think that it was a good observation on your part. There is not an intention to add those to this particular policy. But we certainly, if you have some suggestions on wording, we certainly would consider that. But that was the intention of the work group, to shorten it, to provide just a concise statement, and then to get into the specifics in an administrative regulation, which they are working on.
Did they look at the requirements of that law? That's where my confusion is that the things that they're taking out seem to be the things that the law says will be in a policy. And if I'm thinking that the policy, if a policy is, this is what we're going to do, and the regs say, and here's how we're going to do that, so that's where my confusion is. Again, I see rationale for a policy, but I'm not seeing a policy.
Well, you know, as I examine this, when you look at the first paragraph, it's a statement of purpose, which we generally would see in a policy. And it also indicates that in adopting the regulations, they're going to look at these various publications and laws that have been issued that will flesh out the details that will go into the regulation.
If I could take a shot, I think, Mr. Trotter, what Mrs. Williams is saying is, in what appears before us as proposed policy, should it not delineate out the 5 areas that must be addressed in administrative regulation? Is that what you're saying?
Right. According to what I've read, it says that at a minimum it should include 5 things: goals for nutrition education, nutrition guidelines for food available on campuses, a plan for measuring the implementation of the wellness policy. Those are just a few of the things that the law says must be in an LEA's policy. And I'm not seeing that in this policy. I see a rationale. And so when it says that there's this policy and a regulation, I'm missing the policy. But if it's there, I just need help in seeing it, because I'm not understanding what the policy is.
If I may provide clarification as co-chair of the Wellness Committee, and also, you know, the WIC Child Nutrition Reauthorization of 2004 severely impacts food and nutrition services. So my understanding is that USDA's requirement of an interpretation of the statutory law from Congress is that as long as we are covering the requirements of the reauthorization in both policy and its supporting regulation, then we are compliant with the law. So the committee has taken a very close look at those requirements that used to be in policy, and we are actively working on sliding those to regulation, which of course will come back to the superintendent for approval. But it is our intent, clearly, to maintain compliance with the federal law as it relates to the requirements within the WIC reauthorization of 2004. Is that, we clearly understand what's there and what's required. USDA will allow us to have policy that indicates a regulation that supports that.
Mr. Prue, though, at a minimum, would the Wellness Committee consider listing, you know, at the end of this paragraph, semicolon, you know, these 5 areas, and then you can operationalize those 5 areas in the administrative reg, but that way the board has an assurance that our regulations will cover those things that we're statutorily charged to do.
Yes, we would.
So I guess the question really is before the board, do you want us to take it back prior to second reading and do that, or are you comfortable that we will address it in regulation? As Mr. Prue has indicated, that too would be acceptable. So that's really to the board.
I think this goes to a lot of the discussions that we end up having in policy, which is as we have more and more and more mandates placed on us from state and federal government that we need to comply with, the question is, do you put in our policies the contents of the mandate? Because mandates change as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act changes, as the negotiated agreement changes, and there are aspects of that that end up in policy. The question is, do we want our policies to have the mandates in them, or do we want to leave those mandates to the administrative regulations so that as the mandates change, it's easier to change the regulation? And I'm not taking a position either way. I can just tell you that in the policy committee, those are the discussions that we have. And I'm not sure we have any better answer than all the rest of us do. But I think it's something that we're all struggling with because this is a mandate. It's something we have to do to comply with federal law. Those 5 could change. They could become 6. They could become 3. What the 5 are could change. And I don't have a problem putting them in policy as long as we're conscious of once you put them in policy, if they change, we have to rewrite the policy. And that may not be a bad thing. So I just put that out there as background. That and my 2 colleagues who are on the policy committee can
Well, when
chime
we
in as they
discussed this in the policy committee, if you recall, I questioned putting all this in regulations. I wanted something else in the policy. So I guess the suggestion that Dr. Wilcox has made to simply list those 5 areas might be the way to go.
I think so too.
Or-
It wouldn't hurt.
That wouldn't, if the mandate changes, yes, we still would have to change the policy, but there wouldn't be that much in the policy to change. There would still just be more in the regulation to change, which doesn't require all the red tape that we have to go through to do a policy.
We're not on any, there's no statutory or other requirement that this policy be in place by a particular date. Is that correct?
No. Go ahead.
No, there's no legal requirement.
I just want to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in another box if we don't approve it.
Could I
Mrs.
just
Brightman?
add on, I really think again, if law says we should include in our policy, it seems like we should follow that so that we're completely aligned. And I'm not sure it hurts to force us to pay attention if it does change, to then go back and review again. Things tend to move pretty slowly at the federal level most of the time, so I can't imagine they're going to go after this again right away. But Jeff might have be able to read the tea leaves better than I can on that one. But to add on to that, I would like somewhere in the policy, because I think it was mandated just a few years ago that we have a wellness committee. So it's not an option, it was mandated, and shouldn't that remain in the policy? I'm not sure quite where to put it. I know it says Washington County Public Schools Wellness Committee, and then we've crossed through that. Is there any way of maybe re-including that as we talk about adding these 5 bullets? There are 2 mandates that I feel we haven't made mention of.
The planned regulation at this point does call for the requirement of the Wellness Committee to be a standing committee, so that it's acting regularly and providing resources to school-based level from kind of a larger level, countywide level, to say, here are active resources you can do to make the school environment a little bit healthier.
Is it a standing committee of your department, or is it a standing committee of the elected board?
It is.
Because I'm not sure we've actually included it as a standing committee of our group, have we?
It isn't. The law doesn't necessitate that it would have to be determined and voted on at your level, but that, I assume, would be at your discretion.
I would like to see that discussed. I don't know. Today may not be the day, but
That would mean we would have to amend policy. I don't remember which one it is
for the
to add another standing committee.
I wasn't aware of that designation.
Well,
Anyway,
Would
that's
you like
aside.
me, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
would you like me to withdraw?
well, we can
Right.
either withdraw the motion the second, or we can just vote the policy
it
down,
down.
in which case it'll
It
go
goes
back to
back
committee. And
automatically.
I think we've had enough discussion that you're chair of the committee, but I feel like we've got direction.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, the question is on the motion to approve the policy. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? The motion fails 6-1, and the student concurs with the majority. Did I get that right? All right. Next is the consideration of the second reading of revised policy EFGH and KI.
The Board of Education's business meeting conducted on June 4th, 2013, the first reading of the proposed changes to policy EFGH entitled Surveillance Cameras and policy KI entitled Visitors to Schools were presented for the Board of Education's consideration. The Board of Education approved the first reading of these policies, but with regard to policy EFGH, there was a request to study the proposed change regarding allowing of visual access to 9/11 Emergency Center under certain conditions. Based upon the request, the superintendent submitted new language to the policy committee on the subject paragraph, and the policy committee adopted the superintendent's recommendation. We are requesting the Board of Education's approval of the second reading of the changes to policy EFGH and KI.
Is there a motion to approve the second reading of policies EFGH and KI?
Mr. President, I move for the adoption of revised policy EFGH and revised policy KI.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. Harshman. Is there any discussion? Mrs. Brightman?
First of all, I appreciate the superintendent's changing of the wording for this, and that's great. I guess it now begs some further questions, and maybe, Dr. Wilcox, you could help clarify. Once technology permits, and once the connection is made or permission is given to the emergency services agency, is it a case-by-case? Does that connection stay once we give it? Is it always there? Is it just on a emergency base? Help me sort of understand what this looks like.
Our intention is it would be based on a case-by-case approval, that it would be coordinated through Mr. Ganley and his relationship with local law enforcement. Once we would give them access to the portal,
Right.
we would then close that portal, not make it available to them anymore after they've completed their investigation.
And the standard operating procedure or policy of the emergency agency, what do they do with the data they've collected when the portal's open? Is that like automatically deleted? How is it used? Is it stored? Is it?
I'd have to ask Mr. Ganley, but I think what Mr. Ganley, if you come forward, I think what we've been contemplating in this policy is that in an ongoing active emergency situation, they would have the ability to look into our situation. We are not granting by this policy the opportunity to record those images or store those images for any prolonged period of time.
That's my concern, is how it could or might be used after the fact.
We're not granting that authority. We're simply saying that in a real-time event, you may look in, view only, the scene.
Okay. All right.
If someone, and Mr. Trotter, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, if somebody would request footage that was digitally stored, they would have to do that with a subpoena that would come forward to us. That's been our operating procedure. We'll cooperate fully, but we expect that they issue a
There
subpoena.
would be paperwork, there would be a
Yes.
process, this wouldn't be an automatic.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm much more comfortable with that. Thank you.
Are there any other
Thank you,
questions or
Mr. Ganley.
comments?
I have a question, actually.
Sure.
So this camera access is for emergencies and that sort of thing. So would we do drills and practice this sort of access, or is this just case by case, like you said, that just if there is an emergency, then all of a sudden the sheriff's department has access?
We would have to grant the access. So one of the things that we may do early on, perhaps as early as this summer, if this policy is passed, is have Mr. Ganley reach out to the sheriff's office or to the emergency responders facility and say, in case of emergency, here's how you would access this portal. And then we would give them the specific information they would need to see that. Then we would take it down. But my sense is right now, the county has the technology and the ability to access these web-based technologies if we would give them permission.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct, Mr. Ganley?
And I do have a question on
You're-
KI, if,
You're all
Yeah.
set? Okay, Mrs. Bright?
no, you're fine. On visitors to schools, and I think this is covered somewhere else, but I didn't cross-reference it. How do we handle contractors' access to schools during the school day? Do they sign in as well? And what kind of liability do we have when contractors are in the building during the school day when students are there?
They would be required to follow the same procedures as any visitor. And we haven't had any incidences, but if there's some sort of claim that might arise, our normal process would be to notify MABE. Our expectation would be that the company that assigned that person to come to our particular building that may have subjected us to liability would accept responsibility for any legal claim that might arise.
Is there any kind of background, prior background check done on contractors before they go into a school system or a school?
There is, number one, there's existing law that, number one, makes it a crime for anyone who's a registered sex offender to be on school grounds. That's number one. Number two, in the area of construction, there was a law enacted that requires that the contractor only assign individuals to work on school premises that are not registered sex offenders. So what we see in the law is restrictions on registered sex offenders.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions or comments? Seeing none, the questions on Mrs. Fisher's motion to approve policies EFGH and KI. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? The motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs. Thank you, Dr. Marco, Mr. Trotta, Mr. Ganley. Next on the agenda is the professional services agreement with Meritus Medical Center.
I'm going to ask Mrs. Bishop to join me from Meritus.
Good afternoon, Ms. Bishop. Welcome.
We are bringing forward for the Board of Education's consideration professional service agreement for school health services between Meritus and Washington County Public Schools. We did make several changes based on the last conversation when we brought this to the board. We have included EpiPens into the contract. Reading the medical center will administer and provide all of the medical services detailed in Section 74262 of the Education Article of the Annotated Code of Maryland, which concerns the use of epinephrine in public schools. And we also, in terms of suicide, students in mental health services included the medical centers shall immediately report to a school administrator any concern regarding the mental health of a student. The medical center staff shall assist the school administrator in taking any appropriate action to address such concerns.
Thank you, Dr. Marco. Is there a motion to approve the agreement with Meritus Medical Center for School Health Services for the 2013-2014 school year?
Mr. President, I move for adoption.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Ridenhour. Questions and comments? Mrs. Williams?
Looking at page 4, number 17 speaks to a performance evaluation, and I was just wondering what we did at the end of the last school year in terms of evaluating Meritus's performance under this agreement, and what do we have planned for 2013-2014?
Mrs. Williams, the state has been very interested in this unique partnership, and they began the year in the fall. I believe it was late September, early October. The state came in and did a complete audit of Meritus and Washington County Public Schools. Since then, we've had one follow-up conversation involving the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, as well as the Maryland State Department of Education, Meritus, and the Washington County Health Department. We had that conversation with Dr. Wilcox and that group, I would say mid-spring this year, just to do a follow-up evaluation of where we are with services. The other two avenues that we have for constant review of how we're doing is we have the School Health Council, which is chaired by Mr. Ross, who is the CEO of Meritus, as well as Dr. Wilcox. So those are our formal and informal mechanisms to monitor.
Other questions? Mrs. Brighton? I'm sorry, were you finished, Mrs. Wood?
I'm finished for now, thank you.
When I look at the School Health Advisory Committee, and it appears that minutes had not been taken or this past year, so there's not going to be a lot of record of that. And I noticed the statement here saying the need to do
Yes.
that. I guess my question, are these meetings open to the public? Is there an opportunity for public participation? I just remember when we first looked at this changeover, there was a lot of concern by parents, by nurses themselves, that somehow the service would be reduced or changed, and the safeguard, or one of the safeguards, was to have this public committee. When I look at the makeup of it, it's almost all what you'd call insiders.
Yes.
There's one parent. I'm not quite sure how that might completely fully represent the public. So if nothing else, it seems like there should be an opportunity for public input or concerns being brought to this committee. It seems like I thought I remembered that we had talked about reports from that committee to this body, and I'm not sure that's ever officially happened, and that's as much my fault for not following up and asking my colleagues for that opportunity to hear from that committee. Just to give an example, the last meeting we had where we tabled this discussion for today, I received a call from someone that they just said, oh, what's going on? You know, prices have changed. There was a lot of confusion from that last meeting out in the public. So I know it's very broad. I guess I'm still concerned that we're not giving the public the chance they may want to have more participation.
And I certainly agree, Mrs. Brayman. This has been a new process for all of
Right.
us, and certainly we're learning from not necessarily mistakes, but things we didn't know. So moving forward, I think all your recommendations, certainly we can open it to the public and also provide annual reports on the status of Meritus
And actually put a notice out saying we're meeting
and record the minutes.
and record them and maybe allow for, I don't know what, you've attended the committee meetings. It seems like there might be an opportunity to be more inclusive.
I think there are some opportunities, but I think one of the things that I would say is I would want to spend some time talking with Mrs. Bishop and the Meritus team. They are a private enterprise, and they may not want this meeting to be fully public. There may be a public participation portion, but the entire meeting may not be open with them. And again, I don't know that. There's been no indication that that would be the case. But as a partner, I'd like to talk to them about it before we actually commit to doing it. I would say that absolutely the minutes of our meeting should be a public document. If I participated as a superintendent of schools, it really has to be at that point. So I certainly think we can give more reports. But one thing that Mike, I don't know if you pointed out in the memo, is that the agendas for these meetings are available, and they are a matter of record. We certainly would provide those agendas so you'd see the kinds of topics that were there. You might also note that we did have a broad outreach in the beginning of the year for public participation on this committee, and we really only had 3 parents who indicated they would, and only 1 who followed up with us. So the interest in it, while was very large early on,
Beginning.
I think it subsequently faded because I think people saw that, you know, the spirit of Meritus and the school district was positive, and also the fact that we retained 70% or so of the employees from the health department really mitigated some of the fears that we were out to outsource or privatize it of our own volition. Because if you remember, and I think the community who's probably listening for the first time in a long time to this conversation knows that this was not something the school system set out to do. This was something that was kind of forced upon our shoulders. One of the nice things that I would say about this contract is we have every indication that we're actually going to come in under budget this year. We believe that we have provided increased services for kids. We believe that for the first time we know exactly what we're seeing kids for and the frequency that we're seeing those kids, so we're able to address some of the chronic health issues that have been beset upon our community. So we feel pretty good about it, but I think you're absolutely right. We do have to work harder at making it a more transparent process, making sure that people know exactly what we're doing with this, because it is public money that's paying for it ultimately.
Exactly. So, and I know that maybe the height of concern or interest has died back, but I think it's our job to kind of just keep an eye on
Well,
things.
absolutely. There was even a letter to the editor a couple of weeks ago in the paper, you know, saying
And there
some
was
things about it.
misinformation.
A lot of misinformation,
Yes.
and we didn't have a forum to counter that, but we certainly would invite that gentleman to visit with us anytime who wrote that letter.
Okay. One other on page 2, under 9B, where it talks about the board and the elected officials, employees, departments shall be covered or insured against liability. And Mr. Trott is still here, and maybe he can help me with this, but I believe under Comar, Board of Eds can be sued. And so I'm not sure whether this, which would take precedent, Comar, or whether this gives us the exemption for that situation if there is some liability question.
This section protects the board's interest and its financial interest. In the event there was a claim that arose as a result of Meritus's negligence or that of its agents, its carrier would be primary to cover the board and its employees. So we would not have to activate our coverage under MABE, Maryland Association of Boards of Education. Now, they could assert sovereign immunity. I mean, that's something that they would do as part of their defense of any claim for the board. But the benefit of this paragraph is it makes them primary when you look at a claim that arises.
Okay, that's good clarification. And I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any, Mrs. Fisher?
I've got a two-part question. It refers to page 12, last page of the contract. This page lists some additional items that the medical center makes the board pay or requires the board to take care of. Lab license fees, some travel expense reimbursement, and medications. Are those three costs paid to the medical center? Is the first part of my question.
The travel expenses are for the nurses to travel between the schools, particularly supervisor nurses.
Right.
And we do pay them, and then we invoice the board for those expenses. The license renewal, those are the laboratory licenses that we need for the health rooms, and they expire every 2 years. So we have renewed them, and then we do invoice.
So the money would be going to the medical center. The second part of that then is the very last sentence of the contract says, in no event shall the total compensation of the medical center exceed the sum of blank, blank, blank. Is it not possible that those additional items that have been added into this contract could put that cost over that sum?
We do not expect it to. We did add it up into the budget where the total is $2,793,000.
I don't believe that's added in.
Yes.
I don't think the 20,000, the 5,000, or the lab, and we don't know what the lab license fees are. I don't think those three things are added in that.
That is from last year. That needs to actually be removed because last year the travel expense was expected to be 20,000, and we're very pleased that it hasn't been that. It's been 5,000. Medications was budgeted last year. We found that that was not an expense that we incurred.
That was in anticipation of the EpiPens that we had to purchase, but in fact we received them
We did a
free.
grant.
In the future, though, there will be a cost associated with EpiPens.
And if I could add some clarification, the way the budget is designed, it is a fixed price contract. So when you look at that figure at the bottom there, the 2.7 figure, if they budget us, if they invoice us more than that amount, we will not pay it. That's the first thing. The second is this is a reimbursable contract. That is that they incur the expense or they incur the labor. They then invoice us. Those invoices are measured against what's in the contract, and they can only be reimbursed for those expenditures and costs that are authorized under the contract. But it cannot exceed that 2.7 figure.
Okay. Thank you.
It's sort of a way to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
It's sort of a way to force Meritus to live within the budget as well as us, because if they don't manage their resources, time, and funds correctly, and they run up against that ceiling, they don't get any more. So not that they wouldn't manage it correctly, but it sort of provides a protection on both sides. Mrs. Harshman?
I had a question about, it was page 12, and I believe Mrs. Fisher mentioned the license renewals.
Yes.
Is there a reason that the board is paying for those? Normally, if you are employed by someone, don't they assist with the renewals? I know teachers have to pay for theirs.
This is not the staff license. This is actually giving us permission to perform some minor laboratory testing in the health rooms. For example, if we're checking a child's blood sugar, the state of Maryland requires that we have this. It's called a CLIA license for each school. They were in place before the health department had them, before us. So it isn't an individual employee license. It's actually the program license.
Facility.
So it's
each
for the
school.
facility.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
then-
I would point out that that's payable to the state of Maryland, and we explored seeking an exemption from that fee. They refused to grant us an
Yeah.
exemption,
Yes.
notwithstanding the work that's taking place in the schools. And that may be something we might want to explore in the future, but we were disappointed in the state's position on that.
Okay, and then the other one was the tuition, CMT to LPN. Again, with our employees, we do not pay the full tuition for anything. Are we doing that here, or is this a partial tuition? And why are we paying for tuition for a consulting group?
we really went back and forth with Meredith on this particular topic, asking a similar question as you were asking, Mrs. Harshman. And what I have found when we independently go after LPNs and RNs for our students with disabilities that have one-on-ones, it is almost impossible to recruit an RN and LPN. This allows Meredith to continue to build a pool where we're not struggling to have LPNs and RNs in our schools, which historically for the health department and historically for us has been quite a challenge.
In addition to some of the internal, we thought that this was not really unlike some of the reimbursement programs we have for some of our teacher corps, where we are paying tuition, for example, for some who are pursuing postgraduate studies or graduate
yes, but
studies.
it's not full. It's not full tuition.
Well, but
that's
it's,
why I was asking if this was full coverage. We don't pay for anybody
well, we're not,
to move up to
well,
master's.
I think what
or
we're saying
doctorate.
here is that this we will allocate this amount of money, and Meredith will make that decision as to what they reimburse or what they do. We're not making that decision for them, whether it's full or partial. I mean, they have to marshal those resources against the number of RNs or LPNs that they are trying to create from the CNA
And is
portion.
that with the understanding that we would have as many LPNs or RNs as they had promised or needed? In other words, they would definitely move someone up by having them have them receive education to become an RN if they needed more RNs. So they would have to use this to make sure they had.
I think philosophically, and I don't want to speak for Meredith, so please correct me, Ms.
Yes.
Bishop, if I'm wrong, that the team at Meredith would rather have more people with the higher credential than fewer. When you remember that when we were building this plan, we tried to take a look at not just the existing staff at the health department, but based on Meredith's experiences and our experiences, what did we think we need? So I think to staff programs. So I think I would be a little reluctant to describe it as a promise. I think what we said is we want to staff it to this level, but then as we got into it and started looking at the data, we made other decisions about how to deploy staff. And we made those decisions along with Meredith. I mean, it wasn't as if Joe and his team, Jesus, came and said, well, this is what we're doing. They asked us and we talked about those kinds of things. So I think what we have right now is a staffing level that meets the needs of the kids based on our most recent experience. Will that staffing remain the same throughout the year? Probably not, because we'll have different needs in different places. They will move people, they will adjust people. But back to your central point, I think we will continue to encourage Meredith to move folks who are already employed with us as CNAs or some lower level of staff position to higher levels of education and certification.
Okay. Thank you.
Is that fair?
Thank you.
Yes, that's
Based
is
on my
our-
understanding conversation.
That is our philosophy, is to promote lifelong learning and to provide the kids with as many licensed nurses as we can. So this is a means of taking current experienced CMTs who are really dedicated to what they do and retaining them.
Does Meredith finance some of that desire to move up to another level already? I mean, within their ranks?
We do for our current nurses,
Okay.
because we're requiring bachelor's degrees now for our nursing staff that are hired. So we do provide a portion of their tuition. We
Okay.
also look for grants to help fund that. But right now there is, for CMTs, that's unique to the school health program.
Right.
So that's why
Okay.
for us it's a little different.
Thank you.
And I would think this is similar for in any sort of business model, which is if you take the money out of the tuition assistance for some of their employees, it may look like you're saving money, but then you have to spend more money on recruiting to find the kinds of people that you're trying to get. So it's not a dollar for dollar save is all I'm saying. The question is, do you invest in and grow your workforce and if they have to spend more recruiting nurses to be part of our program, that's a cost that they're going to want to pass on to us, whether it's in an administrative fee or something else of that sort. So the question is, do you want them to grow from within or spend the money trying to find other folks? I think most businesses struggle with that question, and many find that if you build from within in the long run, it makes more business sense.
And these CMTs have a unique skill set in that they've worked in the schools and built relationships, which I know that our stakeholders were very pleased last year when we were able to return many of them to their positions.
Mrs. Fisher, you had another question?
Yes. From what my research, both CMTs and LPNs have a 1-year basic requirement of education or training. Can you explain the difference to me between a CMT and an LPN?
Yeah, their training is different. A certified nursing assistant can only work under the direction of a licensed nurse, so they essentially have to be supervised. They can be delegated specific nursing tasks, but they can't independently function without supervision. An LPN is a licensed nurse, and they have more independence and can function more in the manner of a registered nurse. They certainly have to be collaborating with a registered nurse, but an LPN can actually delegate to a medication technician. So it's a different level. It's a nurse versus a non-nurse.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? I'll just back up something that Dr. Marco said in the discussion about accountability and evaluation. During the lobbying day in Annapolis last, January, from the Community Lobbying Coalition, Dr. Wilcox and Mrs. Bishop and Dr. Shapiro and I met with Delegate Serafini and the State Secretary of Health, who was very interested in sort of the model that we've developed for this. He was particularly interested, I won't say not in the cost savings, but particularly interested in the wellness aspect of it and how the interface between the private medical provider and the public school system could really provide for an improvement in public health and the long-term costs that that might save to the state and anybody who provides health care. So it was an interesting meeting, and clearly what Dr. Marco said is true. The state has their eyes on what we're doing and what other districts across the state are doing. So
I would simply add we are probably the most well-watched public-private partnership in the state of Maryland right now, particularly when it comes to delivering health services, which is not a bad thing.
No.
Blazing the trail. If there are no other questions, the question is on the motion by Mr. Bailey to approve this professional services agreement with Meritus Medical Center. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? The motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs. Thank you, Ms. Bishop. Thank you, Dr. Marco. Thank you, Mr. Trotta. Next on the agenda is a consent agenda for maintenance and support for the VoIP telephone system and a roof for 10435 Downsville Pike.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hardings, Dr. Wilcox, and members of the board. We have 2 bids to present this afternoon. The first solicitation was issued in order to establish an annual contract for maintenance and repair services to our Avaya S8700 voice over IP telephone system. The telephone system consists of a communications manager, a configured PBX with dual servers, and approximately 1,300 telephones. The system utilizes our data network for its connectivity. The contract is for a 1-year period, effective August 1st through July 31, with 2 possible optional renewals. We did solicit prices from 6 companies who are Avaya certified to work on our phone system and received 1 proposal back from our incumbent company. We've taken a look at their prices and feel that they have made a fair offer in light of what we think these items would cost us in the marketplace from other companies, and are recommending to move forward with that single bid from Altura Communication Solutions at a total cost of $74,388.47. The second bid on your agenda this afternoon is the roof replacement for the administration building on Downsville Pike. We received those bids just yesterday morning here at the administration building. This roof work was anticipated when the building was purchased, and we were pleased, I would say, with the bids that we received and the participation of by 6 bidders in submitting price proposals to the school system. Prices are inclusive of the all equipment, services, and labor needed for the replacement of the roof areas, on all the roof areas for roof overlay treatments. The project will be substantially complete on November 1st, with final completion at the end of November. The lowest priced responsive and responsible bidder is J&R Roofing Company of Jessup, Maryland, and we're recommending award to them in a total amount of $448,633. That would be the base bid and alternate GC3, again, for the overlay work on all the building roofs at that facility. The contract would include unit prices to regulate any changes to the cost of work after it's undertaken. J&R Roofing, I don't believe, has performed any work here at Washington County Schools since I've arrived here 6 years or so ago, but they do have considerable experience. They've done several commercial roof installations in the area, mostly in D.C. and the Baltimore region. That said, I have Arnold here, Mark Mills, and Rob Rollins, if you have any questions about these bids today.
Thank you, Ms. Freeman. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Ridenhour. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. Brayton. Other questions? Mrs. Fisher?
If we're going to do alternates 1 and 2, will they also be covered by the 20-year warranty?
Mrs. Brayton?
What kind of protection, and I guess I should know this, but I don't, so I'm asking the question, do we have, when we go to contract with a company, that they don't then sub that work out to another company? Is there something in our procurement or in our bid that keeps that from happening without our?
Yes, every solicitation includes the form of contract, which in this case for construction work, it's always the standard AIA contract, and it includes language regarding substitution of subcontractors during the progress of work. It's very, there are pre-approvals that are necessary. In other words, the contractor doesn't have the ability to propose a substitute contractor without notifying us in advance and obtaining our pre-authorization to do that.
And
Rob probably
that
can
would
speak to
apply
that.
to the telephone system maintenance and upgrade as well?
Yes.
There's no difference with a telecommunication versus a construction protection?
That one, the form of contract is different. It's not our standard contract, but it does also include language that address their ability to subcontract.
Okay.
Generally, we almost always reserve the right to not allow it without prior approval.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? I have one on the Avaya contract. That's, we're only approving year 1 of that at this point, is that correct?
Yes.
And that is it being a professional services contract in year 2, if it's going to proceed, it would have to come back to the board since it's over 50,000?
If it's defined wholly as services, part of the challenge we have is that in this case, it is services. There's no update. So yes, it would come back to the board.
Okay, so the extensions for year 2 and year 3 would both come back to us next year and the following year, if that's what staff's recommendation is.
Correct. That's
Okay.
correct.
Are there any other questions? Seeing none, the question is on the approval of the consent agenda. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? Motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Freeman. Next on the agenda is a gift from Giant Foods to North Hagerstown High School.
President Hardings, members of the board, Superintendent Wilcox, I am requesting your approval to accept a public gift to North Hagerstown High School in the amount of $6,995.18 from Giant Foods A-Plus Rewards Program. This program distributes money to schools based on purchases made by parents and families. These funds will be used to offset additional expenses related to team transportation costs and fees for athletics officials.
Thank you, Dr. Domain. Is there a motion to approve the gift?
So moved.
Thank you, Mrs. Brightman. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Is there any discussion? I'll just thank Giant Food for their involvement with our schools, and as all those students from North High go to athletic events, this is one of those that they need to thank. So it's great to have community partners like this. All those in favor of accepting the gift? Are there any opposed? The motion passes 7-0 and the student concurs. Thank you, Dr. Domain.
And Dr. Domain, you're 1-0. Well done. I would also like to note that Giant Foods does business here as Martin's food stores. So it's just important for the Martin's folks to get proper recognition for their support of our local schools.
Next is the superintendent's report. Dr. Wilcox.
Yes, we're going to ask some folks to come forward and talk to you about the PARCC assessments and Common Core mathematics and how things are changing for our young people. I believe we're moving up to middle school this month. All right. So will you introduce the team and we'll go from there.
This afternoon we have Kara Reed, supervisor of mathematics, and Mike Lee, mathematics teacher and department leader at Hancock Middle Senior High School. This month, Kara and Mike will provide you with an overview of what a grade 7 student will be expected to do to complete the math assessment prototype on the PARCC, or Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Career Assessment. I think that you will observe that the PARCC prototype is a more complex and multi-step problem compared to our current MSA, Maryland School Assessment question. And now I turn the presentation over to Kara and Mike.
Good afternoon, President Harding, Superintendent Wilcox, and members of the board. As you know, and we shared the last time we presented, the Common Core certainly is more rigorous, coherent, and focused than other curricula for mathematics in the United States. So to meet the rigor of the Common Core, teachers are required to elicit critical thinking and problem solving in their classrooms, as well as building those real-world connections and making sure they're also connecting to literacy skills and developing literacy skills in students in the math classrooms. To assess student performance on the Common Core, Maryland is a PARCC state, so we will use the PARCC assessment. So Mr. Leaf is going to share with you a MSA grade 8 item and contrast that with a PARCC grade 7 item to highlight the rigor of the Common Core. He has experience implementing MSA as well as Common Core and has used PARCC items, prototype items in his classroom.
Good afternoon. The first item I'll share is an MSA question. Please take a minute to look over it. As you can see, all the information that the student would need to solve this problem is given to them in the problem, and then they would select A, B, C, or D. And basically, the student would just have to talk about a decrease and an increase. Even though it appears to be a two-step problem, the work is the same. And this is aligned, as Ms. Reed said, a grade 8 MSA item, and it aligns with the curriculum for ratios, proportions, amount of percent of change, commission, simple tax, and those type of things within that curriculum strand. Now, in comparison, the second item is a PARCC prototype. And again, I'll give you a few seconds to look over this. This is actually going to be a two-part problem. As you can see, this problem from Park, and actually it filters down to the grade 7, which we were working with the grade 8 item earlier, is basically talking again about a decrease and an increase with the sale price and then the sales tax. So the student would have to work this out. However, it's not a multiple choice question. They're going to have to plug the problem in on the computer and submit their answer. Then this actually sets us up for Part B, and this problem aligns us with actually two standards in the Common Core, the ratio and proportions and equations and expressions, where students must use a variety of skills here, especially with proportional relationship and reasoning in order to solve this. And then not only do they need to solve Part A, which sets them up for Part B, they're going to have to justify their answer, and they'll actually, according to this, would write their answer in their booklet. So not that justifying is something new for us. However, and I tell my kids in the old days, MSA, last year, you could just basically show your work, kind of justify what you're doing, and we're okay. However, this takes to the next level to where there are actually more than just one way to solve the problem. They're going to have to critique viable arguments here. They're going to have to think like the mathematician, and are these two methods correct, and will they work? And they're going to then have to justify, they're going to have to prove yes or no, and then go through their mathematics and work things out, and hopefully they would get that right. A big push here for Common Core is that viable argument. Yes, I can stand in front of the classroom and present this work, but then in the olden days, that would be it. We move on. Well, now students have an opportunity then to say, wait a minute, I have another way. And then can they argue, can they debate within their group members and say, well, yes, that works, or no, that does not work because of X, Y, and Z. So to score this, Part A would, if they got the correct answer, would be 1 point, and then for Part B, it is based off of a rubric for 4 points, and there could be partial credit of 2 points for Part B.
So as you can see, the MSA item simply required a student know the algorithm to solve, whereas the Park prototype, they had to solve for the discount, solve for the task, and then critique the argument of others and decide whether or not both or either answer was correct. So Common Core really requires that we shift the way we teach mathematics from, as we've talked about before, a more teacher-centered math classroom to a more student-centered math classroom. The Common Core includes the content, but it also includes the 8 standards for mathematical practice, which we commonly refer to as the math practices. The math practices articulate what it means to be mathematically proficient. So that includes things like being able to solve problems, applying not only your knowledge of mathematics, but also the mathematics vocabulary, and being able to communicate orally and in writing to defend your thinking, but also to critique the arguments of others. Most importantly, the culture in our classrooms must shift to that more problem-solving classroom that promotes critical thinking rather than skills taught in isolation. So Mr. Leaf is going to talk to you about what that means in a middle school math classroom.
The Common Core serves as a springboard for the classroom teacher to make some changes in the math classroom. In a traditional classroom, and when I hear traditional classrooms, I think about sitting in rows, teacher at the board, work a couple problems out. Here's 100. Go ahead and work on your problems, bell rings, and we move on to the next class. And within a traditional MSA classroom, you're still sitting in rows, but you're working with partners, maybe a small group, but yet it's still what I did on the board, we're going to do it together, and then students are going to practice themselves. Where the Common Core makes this huge jump in this change is to where now, as a classroom teacher in the math classroom, we want to see a struggle. We want to see students having a productive struggle, not to get frustrated and they give up, but yet that's when we learn, when we're kind of working through the problem and the students within their groups, and they're struggling. And what can we do then to take that struggle and have them learn from that? So we want to take that struggle, but yet how can we make this more meaningful to the student? So when they walk out of our math classroom, math isn't over, that they're going to take it to the next class. And some of the great comments I hear from my kids are, well, in tech class, we were building this, they built an M&M dispenser. And then we started talking about probability, and we started talking about measurements. And then in the science classroom, oh yeah, we work on the same formula in science class. So actually to see that connection to where they're not just sitting in my math classroom doing math and they walk out the door and they're finished with math. In this type of classroom, we have to deprogram our kids from MSA type of problems into the PARC tasks, to where we can set up the problem and the students work this out in their group. They struggle, they learn, they get frustrated, but yet they get it. And we want to allow ample opportunities for that. As teachers, we need to be flexible. We need to be several steps ahead of the students. As in Part B, there's more than one way to do the problem. But as a classroom teacher, students will say, well, what about this method? What about this method? Will this work? Well, let's try it. And as long as it works every time, we got something. But as soon as it doesn't work in the math classroom, then we have to look at another method. But yet, as we talk about to be mathematically proficient, we want to talk about students thinking as a mathematician. Can they use the vocabulary? Can they talk mathematics? Can they communicate? Can they be mathematically literate within the classroom, to where we're just not saying this is how we're going to do it and you have your little sayings or whatever, but if we talk about properties of operations, all right, do our kids know what we're talking about? Can they relate to that problem? And we also have to understand misconceptions of our students. Seventh graders will typically make these type of mistakes with these type of problems, so we need to prepare for that, and again, be several steps ahead of our students. And as Ms. Reed noted, the standards for mathematical practice in the Common Core is our guide to have our students become mathematically proficient. And eliciting these practices is a daily goal for math teachers.
So as we continue toward the 13-14 school year, those student-centered classrooms continue to be our focus in mathematics, making sure that we're eliciting the standards for mathematical practice and continuing to focus on literacy as we support those classrooms with problem solving and critical thinking at the forefront. We also continue to seek ways to make connections across curriculum and for teachers to work with one another rather than in content silos. What questions do you have for us?
Questions? Ms. Fisher?
I can understand why some math teachers might have some objections to this curriculum, because they're going to say, well, I'm not a writing teacher, and why should I have to have? But I believe that if the student has to explain his or her thinking, that student is going to understand his work and his problem better, and therefore be able to better solve that type of problem next time they look at it. I also think it's going to help the teachers to understand where a student might be having a problem trying to understand a thought problem, and help that teacher help the student then to correct his way of thinking. The other part of this is I have a question. Are students, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, are students going to be allowed to use calculators or the calculator on the computer as they're doing the math part of the test?
That has been a significant conversation that has not, as of my last discussion with the state coordinator for mathematics, that decision has not been made. There will be an online calculator, and parts of the assessment will be paper at the rollout, and parts will be online. But I don't know whether or not students will be able to use, students who don't receive special services like their SWDs,
right,
whether or not they'll be able to use their calculator that they're accustomed to use.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Burton?
I love the terminology deprogramming. And I think that may go to the root of what we're dealing with when we look at a gap or talk about the gap between MSA and PARC assessments. My instincts tell me that the students are going to be deprogrammed quicker than the teachers. because they're newer to the system, they're not as ingrained in some of the status quo approaches to teaching. What is your take on that? And I know that's very open-ended, and I meant it to be, and maybe Dr. Domain, could have a response as well, but this is going to be a tough sell to teachers and maybe a little bit easier to students. Where do you come down on that one?
I think it's a change, so it's a challenge for all of us. And in talking to teachers and working with teachers, they understand and embrace that need for change, but it's a pedagogical change. I've seen a lot more frustration from students, actually, because we've created a culture where students are accustomed to, is this right? And I say, well, tell me what you think, or what would happen if, or how can you explain that to me? They want to know, is it right or is it wrong? That's very frustrating for students to not be certain whether or not they have that right or wrong answer. So I think it's all of us moving forward, parents as well, because it's a difference in what a math classroom looks like. So we all need to have that understanding of this is going to be different, but it's also really good, and it's good for kids, and to have that critical thinking, problem solving, real world connections, cross content connections is just going to make them richer as they advance to be productive members of society.
I concur. While to us these are two completely different, modalities and what's being required of students, however, for a very long time now, we have been talking about how content needs to be related to students' personal experiences. We've talked about literacy across the curriculum. Students, they need to have a deep understanding of reading. They need to be able to write, to explain in all content areas. So while it may appear that the shift is sudden in our paradigms, I really think that we've been talking about this for quite a few years in education. It's just that we're being pushed now with a definite deadline to make sure this happens.
Do you see technology as being an aid here? When we talk about doing things differently in the classroom, the idea of flipping a classwork with homework and having the students prepare at home and then come in and have more interactive at-risk conversations. Do you see technology helping there?
Well, certainly.
You know the answer, but I'm
I'm
leading you on that one.
Right.
Yes.
So certainly, but I also see technology is a tool. Yes. And I think we have to make sure that we are steeped in understanding what those student-centered classrooms look like philosophically and pedagogically, and then lining up the technology with it. It's just like any other tool in a classroom. I can use it well, or I can struggle with my use of it. So we continue in our work with department leaders and with lead teachers and with teachers on professional development to bridge those, how we can use technology, what technologies are out there. Because really, one thing that I missed in fielding your question the first time, learning math this way is more fun, and it's more fun to teach math this way. So I think that's a huge advantage as we make this change for teachers and students. It's a more fun environment to learn the mathematics.
Thank you.
Mr. Bailey?
A question for Mr. Leaf. I'm sure in the classroom you're very effective. You were effective in the presentation. I'm just wondering if it's not too personal, you could tell us a little bit about your background in mathematics.
I've been a 7th grade math teacher now for 16 years, and I tell the kids I don't even get promoted for good behavior. But, and I've been in Washington County. I have a master's degree in administration supervision. I'm highly qualified according to the federal guidelines. I enjoy mathematics. It's something that I really enjoy. I tease my students that in the traditional classroom that I grew up in middle school, that if I got 100 problems for homework, I loved it in math, but give me 5 vocabulary words and I complained. So I enjoy math, and I was talking with Ms. Reed about this. I'm looking forward to this change, to this productive struggle with kids, to where we get away from, yes, you're right, now we're going to move on because we have to, where the kids can actually work the problems out, and they can come up with these different methods that work. And a big comment I hear from parents, well, you don't teach math the way I did math.
Right.
Well, now hopefully we can partner better with parents and say, well, that's okay, because there's more than one way to do these problems. Now, I may show your son or daughter maybe a more efficient method or another method that will work as well, but certainly if we have a method that works, we can keep using that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mrs. Hirschman?
I just have one quick question. After learning math this way, if the cash register breaks down at the store, will the students be able to make change?
They better.
Yes.
Because they can't now.
And I talking about real, excuse me, talking about real life. I tell the students a story. I was at a restaurant years ago, and the power went out, and it only affected the cash register. And we were talking exactly one of these type of problems where the price of my meal, whatever, was $30 or whatever. Well, they couldn't get the tax, remember what the bill was, and I just simply said on the second part there, well, just take 1.05 times $30, and that's it. And then I had to go into a math lesson right there in the restaurant, but that was okay because I enjoyed doing that. But this type of stuff is real world, where we're going to see that connection as our kids move through our
And they will do that without calculators.
Well,
yes.
The way that, starting from kindergarten forward, it requires that the students understand it conceptually and not just procedurally.
Good.
Which, yes.
I think my approach to school was somewhat similar to Mr. Lath's. Give me 100 problems in math and I was a happy guy, but asked me to do his vocabulary workshop when I was in school, and filling in the sentences killed me. And I say that only partially tongue-in-cheek because it's a concern that I have, not a concern, but something I wonder as we go through this transition, and that is, are there instances where a student who doesn't even have a deficit, but for whom ELA doesn't come naturally to them, let's put it that way, that would mask their fluency in mathematics because of all the language that's now being incorporated into their requirement to explain it. I think Mrs. Fisher is exactly right, is that if a student can explain why they've done what they've done in math, and it will help the teacher, help the student. But there are some students, frankly like I was, for whom the language, I didn't get that until much later on. As an elementary student, it just wasn't my thing. And I worry that, are we going to have ability and real fluency in mathematics masked by students who may not be as good verbally?
Well, there's always been some of that with students in mathematics, just with word problems and that type of thing, where students who struggle with language might struggle with that. But what I'm hearing you ask is, as far as me understanding my thinking and my rationale between how I solved my problem to you if I didn't solve it in a more traditional way. I think that comes down to us having knowledgeable teachers in the classroom who know and understand the mathematics that they're teaching and are able to ask those questions. The Common Core allows us much more time in the classroom to teach the content because it's not a mile wide and an inch deep like our current curriculum, or the Maryland curriculum. So in having that extended time to teach the content, it also allows us as teachers to ask those questions and get deeper into student thinking. That's not to say that we won't have some students like that who might get tripped up by the vocabulary, but it gives us the opportunity to spend more time with those students, to pull a small group of students or to pull one student aside and to work with them to try to get to their thinking. So we're aware that students like that exist, and that we need to make sure that we're differentiating in our classrooms on a daily basis to meet the needs, and so that those students don't fall through the cracks and get missed.
Is there still a role for 100 questions for homework in math?
Yes
I
and no.
say that seriously.
Yes,
I mean,
yes and no, because
is there still a place for that?
not necessarily 100 questions, but
No,
math
I'm-
practice, yes, because students can think that way, but yet now if they can't, we're getting to a lot of type of equations where they might start to combine like terms, use the inverse operation. They may be able to set that up, but if they can't go through the process and solve that, then we're going to have struggles. So yes, I believe there's still time in the classroom and for homework for the practice.
There's still a role for repetition,
It's-
which is really the question I'm asking.
It's all about balance, and so there will still be, you need to practice. You must practice the mathematics to ensure your understanding of it. Do we need
So
to
if-
continue? If you've demonstrated mastery of a concept, do you need to continue by doing hundreds? No, once you have that mastery. But
Yeah,
it's
but
all
if-
about balance.
If somebody were to say, we're a school where we don't use worksheets, which is something I've heard.
Well,
Is that-
when it comes
what do
to
we think about that?
worksheets, when it comes to worksheets, as the supervisor of mathematics and others that have been in this position, that has been the mantra, that we don't want to see every student in a classroom working on the same worksheet. That's not.
Well, that's a different question than what I asked. Is there a role for
You're asking me about worksheets. Is
Is
there
there
a
a
role
role
for
for-
worksheets?
is there a role
Are
for
they
worksheets?
differentiated? Are the questions on the worksheets appropriate and aligned with the content that's being taught?
So it sounds like you're saying, no, there's not
It
really
all
a role
depends
for
on,
worksheets.
worksheets can look very different. So I would have to see the worksheet to answer that question
I think you just did.
appropriately.
Thank you.
I think there are just a couple things that I'd like to add. And this may be somewhat in support of the idea that Dr. Hardings was saying. I've recently had an experience with a youngster who was being asked to do some tutoring around the SAT test. And as the tutoring began, there was just some recall that needed to be done of some basic facts so they could make some estimates and do some things. And I know this young student, and the young student was kind of perplexed because didn't have that great working command of some multiplication tables. And when I challenged her about it, she said, Dad, I always have a calculator. That's just easy. I don't need it. But what she could have used was a couple hours of just drill and kill some skills. She needed some worksheets. So I think there is a time for worksheets when you're learning fundamentals. I think there's also a time when you simply need the discipline of going through a problem multiple times, and I think that's, Mr. Leaf, what you're saying. There are those occasions where you're going to put 20 problems on a page and kid's going to work through it, and the next day you're going to come back and kind of see their thinking. There is going to be that time. Because I think if kids don't have a fundamental understanding of the math, then some of these conversations are not going to be as rich, because they're going to be spending so much of their working brain, their short-term capacity, trying to calculate that they can't think and move things into longer-term memory. So I think that's important, that we don't completely throw out the baby with the bathwater here, and we don't send a message to our community that basic facts are not important to us anymore. Having some fluency with fractions and estimation are not important to us. They are. The other thing I want to say is that when you look at the first problem, you can almost solve that first problem even if you're a non-reader. If you can pick up a couple of words, really three, reduced, increased, you can figure this one out. On the other hand, when you start to look at the other one is much richer in vocabulary. So this gives us another opportunity to kind of integrate instruction, to have our reading language arts people, to have our social studies people, to have other people all working together kind of in a common pursuit of being able to solve this math problem. Because there are things in this problem that if you don't understand contextually, you can't make sense out of the problem. So it is a deeper, richer kind of learning. One of the things that struck me with the Park 7th grade assignment, and it's the last line, it says, are they both correct? Well, I've got to talk about that a little bit, but even that last one, use the properties of operations to justify your answer. There are just a lot of kids who really don't understand some of those things. Whether it's, you mentioned here several times, I think, inverse operations. We've talked about the order of operations. We've talked about a number of things. kids have to have this deep level of understanding in the Common Core environment. So I want to thank you for taking time to have this presentation with us. I think that this is one of those topics where the board really enjoys having this kind of conversation. We have a number of people who have been teachers. We also have some people who have been very well educated. Coming together, we can talk a little bit more about what that's going to look like. That's the purpose of having these short-term conversations so that we can get to that longer-term conversation. So I want to thank you as the superintendent for the work you're doing. I also want to visit your classroom now, Mr. Leaf. Sit down and maybe we can get you out of 7th grade after 15 years. Who knows?
I will be teaching some 8th grade, so things.
You are a work in progress. Amen. Thank you, Dr. Harding.
No, you go ahead. I've already had
I'm
a
just
pass
curious
at it.
because I'm looking at that question. And what do you do when, let's say you get to a question where there's not enough information to compile a correct answer? If you look at that, there, you know, this question can't be answered. Either one of those could be right, depending on what the law is with sales tax. Is the sales tax applied to the sale price, or is the sales tax applied to the retail price? They're going to come out a little bit different, depending. So how do you rectify that or resolve that with the student? They're going through all the processes and working their brains out. I'm not, you know, how do you tell them, well, it might not be the right answer? We don't know. They haven't given enough information.
Well, part of the prompt for the answer is to justify your answer. So if a student makes an assumption that's different from, let's say, Maryland, and applies that in their response, then as the teacher, I would know that when I graded it if they've communicated well in their response. Because the whole key is justifying.
Okay, the whole key is justifying. Wouldn't have been very good on Apollo 13, just justifying. The right answer might come in handy occasionally. You understand where I'm coming from?
I do.
Kara? There's no right answer there because we don't have the information to have a correct answer. Read it. Where does the sales tax, where's the sales tax applied? Is the sales tax applied to the $100 or whatever the original price is, or is the sales tax applied after the 10% discount? Is the sales, let's say it's a $100 item.
Right.
Sales tax is applied to the first $100.
Right.
It's $95, or it's $105. And then you take 10% off the 105, which amounts to, let's see, 10.50. So what does it become? Maybe I'm wrong, and I'll screw it up here sooner or later. So you take the 1050 off the 105. So you get 94.50. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay. You take the 10% off. You're right. It does come out the same, I think.
Yes.
Okay. Gotcha. Not wrong.
I'm sorry, Mr. Heidenauer.
No problem. No problem. Took me a while,
I
but
was
I got my
struggling
math right.
with how to respond to you.
No.
She was about to ask you a probing question to see if you understood.
That was a perfect example of what goes on in class.
Productive struggle.
It was a productive struggle, but quite honestly, the student had to work through it now and get to the answer.
Right. And what I like, having some conversations with students where they would use $100 because it's easy instead of the $295. And to me, that's getting it. They made their problem simpler. It was a lot easier to work with those type of numbers instead of, I think it was 295, whatever it was in the first part.
295.
I have some students would use the 295, which is fine, but it's going to take them longer than if they understand what they're doing, well, it's going to work for any amount of money. Or once they work through it, I mean, they have to work through it to make sure it's correct, but to choose $100, to me, they got it.
See, I just spent time yesterday with our teachers in the morning, and one of the things I talked about were some principles of learning design. And one of the things that we wanted were teachers who could set problems up that had kids struggle. But perhaps the most important part of that is it facilitated a fluid transfer of their knowledge. So taking it from 295 to 100, that's fluid transfer of their knowledge. That meant that they, in fact, did understand it. And we're trying to actually develop curriculum that forces people to go through the problem just as Mr. Reidenauer did in real time in a classroom. It's through that examination of thinking that I think we get to much richer classrooms and much greater understanding for kids in the long term. But I will come back to the fact that you can't do those things unless you have a fundamental understanding of mathematics that comes through drill and practice. And to Mr. Reidenauer's point, it is very important that at some point you get the right answer. I don't care how you get there, but you got to get the right answer.
Anybody else? Thank you all. It was a great discussion. Next on the agenda are personnel actions. Ms. Francisco.
Dr. Hardings, Dr. Wilcox, members of the board, as we discussed in closed session, there are some personnel actions for your consideration.
Is there a motion to approve the personnel actions recommended by staff?
Mr. President, I move for staff recommendation on personnel.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Is there any discussion or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? Motion carries 7-0, and the student member abstains. Thank you, Ms. Francisco. Reports to the board. Mrs. Harshman, Curriculum and Instruction.
Curriculum Instruction will hold a meeting August 23rd at 12:45 in the board conference room. We were scheduled to wait until August, but this will be July 23rd.
Thank you, Mrs. Harshman. Mr. Bailey?
Excuse me. Finance will also meet on July the 23rd.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Mrs. Fisher?
Policy Committee has not met since our last business meeting, but will also meet on July 23rd at 11 a.m. in the boardroom.
Thank you, Mrs. Brightman.
Same basic information. Facilities will meet on July 23rd at 9:45 at the Frederick Street location. And I would just take a moment, some interesting information from our strategic plan for MABE. We're planning for 5 years out, and just to give you some examples of what some of our highest priorities, a MABE app to expand the website, interactive blog, create a speakers bureau, rebranding and messaging, an alumni association, expand partnerships with business and other agencies in the education world, regional conferences and training, and in fact, on April 25th, 2014, Allegheny County has invited the adjoining Western Maryland counties to train with them on ethics and some other issues, so that's something we may want to think about attending, doing some online modules and webinars, expanding federal, our presence at the federal level for legislation, and working on questionnaires for candidates for Board of Ed. So a very interesting new approach for MABE on the state level.
Thank you, Mrs. Brightman. Mr. Ridenhour?
HR has not met since last meeting. We will be meeting July 31st at 9 o'clock.
Thank you, Mr. Ridenhour. I'm going to call you Jessen until I get your last name. Anything from student government?
Student government has not met since summer.
All right. And Mrs. Harshman, Mrs. Williams, anything from the MABE Conference Planning Committee? Great. Okay. Future agenda items, we have another discussion on the park assessment on August 6th, as well as on August 20th. Some exemplar school awards, September 3rd. We've also tentatively planned to have a discussion under miscellaneous business at a future meeting of the new state discipline regs for students. As the timing of us having that discussion becomes apparent, we'll slot it in at whichever meeting makes most sense to do that. And the purpose of that will just be to provide, I think, Mrs. Brightman some direction as she's on the May Board of Directors, as well as to see if we want to take a position as a board on the actions that the state board may be taking regarding student discipline. So that will be coming, but the date we're not quite sure yet. Board member comments?
Mr. President?
Yes.
I have a motion that I would like to put forward as a future agenda item. Would
Sure.
that be in order?
Sure.
I move that to be in compliance with policy BAA, which calls for the elected Board of Education of Washington County to conduct an annual self-appraisal prior to October 1st of each year, that a discussion about how the annual self-appraisal will be conducted be included as an agenda item as soon as possible to allow sufficient time to implement whatever form or process of self-appraisal the board determines to be appropriate as a result of that discussion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any discussion? Mrs. Williams, you have the right to speak first to your motion.
I just feel that it would be a worthwhile endeavor, and as policy calls for, that we have the self-evaluation. We're looking to move forward to set goals, and I think this is the time to do that, to be in compliance with board policy.
Can I ask a question? Do you see this, as you said, setting goals internally as a board, setting goals for the superintendent, setting goals for the system?
Board goals for ourselves.
That's what okay, I wanted to be sure what the focus in your mind was.
Goals for ourselves. I see in the 7 years, in the 7 months of board service, I'm seeing practice not totally in alignment with policy. And I understand that there is drift, and I think that it is important that our practice be aligned with our policy. And I know that we are looking at policy and that we are addressing policy. And this is a policy that I think that it is important that we follow, because I think that it has benefit, and that's the basis for my motion.
In your motion, could you please state the motion again, just so I'm sure that we all understand it?
Sure. I move that to be in compliance with policy BAA, which calls for the elected Board of Education of Washington County to conduct an annual self-appraisal prior to October 1st of each year, a discussion about how the annual self-appraisal will be conducted be included as an agenda item as soon as possible to allow sufficient time to implement whatever form or process of self-appraisal the board determines to be appropriate as a result of that discussion.
I have another. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Mrs. Bright.
We've done this in the past. It has not occurred in the last couple years anyway. Generally, the practice in following the policy was to do the superintendent's evaluation and follow that with a self-evaluation or board evaluation. And that was usually done, each of us evaluated our own performance, and then we spoke as a group as to what possibly we could do better as a corporate body. So as far as timeline, generally it followed the superintendent's evaluation. It was sort of a 1-2.
So that's what's happened in the past?
In the past, but not again for at least
Not
2
since-
years.
not since I've been on the
Not, okay, so longer. Okay. 4 years.
Can I ask what as soon as possible in your motion means? I mean, as soon
Well,
as
just-
possible could be next week, or it could be at our immediate next meeting. Is your motion,
Well, the policy says that it is to be done by October 1st of each year. It also says that it can be done more frequently if that's the will of the board. So I would just like to see it done in a timely way so that we can complete the self-appraisal in compliance with what the policy says.
okay, so, but if the motion passes and it's not on the public agenda for the next meeting, or we don't schedule a special meeting before the next meeting,
Mhm.
you're not going to consider that out of compliance
Untimely.
with your...
No, it's that the entire self-appraisal be completed by October 1st. I'm asking that we have a discussion in a timely fashion as to
Okay.
how we're going to complete that self-appraisal in order to have it done by October
Okay, I
1st.
think I understand what
Yes.
you're asking.
Having come
Mrs.
from
Fisher?
a previous board a number of years ago where we did do the evaluations here, they were not done in public sessions.
Okay, I'm
They were
not
done in
asking that
or
it be,
they were done usually in retreats rather than in,
okay, I'm not asking that the self-evaluation be done, that the self-evaluation be done in public session. I'm asking that we discuss the process for doing it.
the process wasn't discussed publicly either. It was all done either in retreat or closed session.
If we schedule time in closed session to discuss this topic, will that, will that meet what you're asking for?
Yes, whichever you deem appropriate, whether we do it in public session or in an executive session, whichever you deem appropriate.
Are there any other comments or questions on the motion?
I'm assuming that the student board member would not be involved with this.
Has not in the past.
Yeah.
Seeing
Neither
none.
is the superintendent.
Seeing none, the question is on Mrs. Williams' motion. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? The motion passes 5-2, and the student abstains. Board member comments? Jessen?
Just again, that I'm very grateful to be on the board with you guys, and I'm looking forward to a productive year.
Mrs. Harshman?
Just welcome to the board.
Thank you.
Mrs. Williams?
Yes, welcome, Jessen.
Thank you.
Mr. Bailey?
I have nothing, Mr. Superintendent.
Mrs. Fisher?
I have nothing.
Mrs. Brighton?
Nothing this evening
Mr.
or
Reitman?
afternoon.
The only thing I have to offer is we do have a policy manual that is there to protect our employees, to protect board members, to protect the processes that we have. There are also rules of parliamentary procedure that allow any member of this board to make motions, to make parliamentary inquiries, and to try to enforce the rules of policy. And I would invite anybody who thinks that I or we are out of compliance with policy to use Robert's rules to make sure that we comply. With no further business before the board, I declare the meeting adjourned.